Hello and welcome back. This is the week 6 lecture. So today we continue to talk about close reading. I covered the basics last week. Hopefully all of that was clear. You guys were able to get some notes and you sort of have a general idea of how this practice or this technique really works. So we talked a little bit about the history of it with the formalists or the new critics. Really one of the first schools of literary criticism to really make an impact in the US. So we're going to talk more about the formalists next week as we start talking about criticism and theory. But for now, we just need to know that they were the guys who sort of gave us this close reading practice, this close reading technique, which we still use today. And just remember that idea of staying inside a text. And remember that it's difficult to do. Like I was saying last week, we often focus on things that will take us outside of the text. Historical context, the biography of the author, philosophical or religious connections, or our own personal connections. As we know, that's often one of our initial ways of analyzing or really responding to literature that we read. We think about how we feel about it. We think about, the connections we might have to the text, based on our own lives, our own experiences. And those are all great things to do. But like I was saying, they take us away from the actual language of the text. And what the formalist wanted to do was really sort of apply an almost scientific level of rigor and close attention to language, the specific elements or devices of language. And to them, that approach would yield better results. It would lead us towards the true interpretation of a text. But I also mentioned that we kind of reject their notion that there's only one correct way to read a text. Most modern teachers of literature and students of literature do not believe that, but we still use close reading just to get us closer to the language, because sometimes it's easy to kind of overlook the language or to, pay most of our attention to other things. This way we stay centered at least a little while on language, and we can usually make some really cool discoveries, and a lot of what we find can spark good analysis. So I hope you guys were able to practice a little bit with the short stories that we read in week 5. Here in week 6, we are reading some poems, and I would like you guys to practice doing this kind of work with poetry. It's good to do it with short stories and poetry so we can get comfortable with both. And what I would like to do today is just kind of model how this work can look. So I wanted to talk about a particular passage from Sonny's Blues, one of the short stories that I assigned in week 5. And also I wanted to look at one of the poems that I assigned here in week 6. And I thought we could just sort of walk through a couple of close readings that I conducted. And obviously, you're not going to find the same stuff that I find. You're not necessarily going to be interested in the exact same elements or devices that I'm interested in. So please don't think that what I'm showing you is, word for word, move for move, what I want you to be doing. I want you to, make your own discoveries, arrive at your own conclusions, but I'm just giving you an example of the kinds of stuff you can look for and the kinds of work that you can do with your discovery. So like I was saying last week, we're looking for imagery, we're looking for word choice, other things that the formalists were really interested in, stuff like irony, paradox. We can always look for contradictions. Do certain words not seem to go together? Do certain ideas or phrases or sentences seem to clash or have some kind of conflict? We might be able to find sources of tension. Again, expressed verbally, expressed directly through a particular word or a particular phrase or a particular image. Those were the kinds of things that the formalists were interested in. Obviously, the form or the structure of a text is also important. So we've talked about poetic form. We can always discuss stuff like rhyme, meter, stanzas if we're looking at a poem, but short stories have structure too. Short stories, novels, plays, all types of literature have some kind of form at work. And if we're just looking at a specific passage, we might become interested in sentence structure. And I'm a little bit interested in that with my examples. We can also look at grammar. We can look at punctuation. Almost anything is fair game, any verbal element. Anything that we can find at the level of the word, maybe even individual syllables, phrases, sentences, anything contained within could potentially spark some good material for a close reading. But remember, the difficult thing is to not make any claims, at least not yet. We can later, but for right now, we're staying inside the text, so we have to stay within our chosen passage. Remember, I said, for a short story, just grab a few paragraphs, maybe just a single paragraph would suffice. And if you're looking at poetry, if it's a really short lyric poem like The Red Wheelbarrow, for example, you can probably tackle the entire poem. That's what I'm going to do today. But if it's a longer poem, of course, you don't have to do the whole thing. You could just tackle one stanza or maybe 2 to 3 stanzas, and you could conduct a close reading on that passage. So we're always looking to grab a relatively small chunk of text, because it's hard to close read 20 pages or even a really long poem that goes on for multiple pages. It's hard to close read the whole thing. There's just too much text. There's too much language. It would take us too long. It's just not practical to cover that much ground. So we find a small passage, and then ultimately what we're going to do with our official close reading, which is our second SAR due at the end of this week, we are going to make that larger connection between our chosen passage and the overall theme of the overall text. Like I said last week, we're not quite doing that on these early practice rounds, but that is what we want to do ultimately on SAR 2. So any passage that you choose, ultimately you need to be able to show how the language in that passage is helping to express some of the larger thematic material at work in the overall text. That's always kind of our end game with close reading, but it's a lot of fun just getting there. And a lot of the discoveries you make, a lot of the claims that you make about language, you can just do stuff with those. They don't always have to take you directly to theme. A lot of that stuff can just be interesting. It can be thought-provoking for you and your readers, and it might also help lead you to other discoveries and other ideas about the text. So again, close reading is just a really nice technique for us to have in our sort of toolboxes. It's a tool. It's a method for analysis. And we're not going to do it all the time, but it's nice to do it some of the time. So I don't want to review a whole lot of the stuff that we went over last week, but I do want to mention a couple of things that I didn't get to in the Week 5 lecture when we were talking about the formalists, also known as the new critics, which is kind of a funny way to refer to them because they're some of the oldest critics that we still study in American sort of literature, in the American literature world. But when they came onto the scene roughly 100 years ago, they were doing something very new by regarding literature as having inherent value as a work of art. Not that nobody else had ever said that before, but typically in academia, the way people approach literature, like I said, was through the lens of history or religion, or let's talk about the moral of the story. How are people going to learn from this? How is it going to be educational or instructional, right? Or what does it say about the author? What does it say about the historical context? All of that stuff. And what the formalists said was, we don't have to care about really any of that. We just care about the text, how the text works. And we want to analyze the text with rigor. And for them, that meant we have to deal with language. We have to stay stuck on language. So just two other ideas that they had. Not all of us will accept these ideas, but they're good things to keep in mind as we continue to practice our close reading. So we kind of got into a little bit of this stuff last week, but I forgot to mention these two terms. So in a lot of their writing, they talked about two common fallacies, two common mistakes that a lot of readers made. And these were things that were preventing readers from really arriving at the one true interpretation, or it was preventing them from being good readers. Again, we don't believe that there's just one true interpretation, but these are, I wouldn't call them mistakes, but they are ways to once again get away from the text, which is, of course, what the formalists were trying to avoid. So the first fallacy is the intentional fallacy. And some of you might be familiar with this. It's just the idea that a lot of readers have trouble separating a literary text from what they think the author of that text intended. And this is something that I think all students go through. So even if you've never heard this exact phrase, you should understand like what's being described here. This is a real fear and apprehension that a lot of literature students feel at some point during their academic careers. When you're trying to interpret a poem or a short story, sometimes you might get a little hung up on, oh, well, that's what I think, but is that what the author really meant? Is that the meaning that the author was trying to get across? And a lot of times that fills students with a lot of uncertainty. That question can be very unsettling because it makes us maybe doubt our own interpretation. Oh, well, that's how I read it, but I don't know if that's what the author meant. But according to the new critics, we don't need to worry about the author. We don't need to really care what the author's original intentions were. Multiple reasons for that. We don't have to get into all of them, but the two most obvious reasons for them, number one, once a piece of literature is created and put out into the marketplace, it's like a painting. It's like, a piece of music, a movie. With any of that, it can be interpreted by the masses however they want, right? It kind of leaves the ownership of the author once it's out there, once it's on bookshelves, or once it's playing in theaters. And a lot of thinkers and scholars would argue that the author kind of relinquishes control once the text is published, or once the movie is made, or the music is being performed, and it's just out there in the world, and it really belongs to the audience members more than it belongs to the author. We don't necessarily have to believe that, but that was something the new critics talked about. And then the other reason, perhaps more practically, a lot of the stuff they were reading, and a lot of the stuff that we read in school will often be written by authors who are now dead. So their point was, we often can't know what an author's intentions were. We don't really have the ability to uncover that, especially if we're reading old literature where the authors have long since died. We can't talk to them. We can't ask them what they meant, what they were trying to say. And again, they weren't very interested in the author anyway. So their point was, just don't worry about it. When you uncover meaning, that meaning exists whether the author intended for it to be there or not. Ultimately, because the intentions can't ever really be known fully. I mean, in some cases, sure, if the author's still alive, they can sit down and tell you exactly what they intended. But that kind of defeats the purpose. If we're just getting it straight from them, we don't have to analyze. We don't really have to do the work. So their point is, who cares? Who cares about the author's intentions? Either we can't know or we don't want to know. And the meaning that we find is valid whether it directly came from the author or if it just sort of arrived through other means. So that might be kind of useful to keep in mind just as a reinforcement of their larger point, which is forget about the author. Don't worry about the author. The author is not standing over your shoulder determining whether or not your interpretation is correct. You have freedom as a reader, as a scholar, as an analyzer. You're making the decisions at the interpretive level. You don't have to double check with the author because, again, obviously we often cannot do that. Both James Baldwin and William Carlos Williams are dead and have been for a long time. So we're on our own when it comes to interpreting their work. So that's the intentional fallacy. And then the other one is called the affective fallacy. A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E. The affective fallacy means that people judge a text largely based on their emotional reaction to the text. And we don't have to avoid that altogether. But again, like I was saying before, that typically, that sort of approach where we're kind of making it about ourselves, how we feel, that's fine. That's often a good thing to do initially when we're, writing a journal entry, taking notes, just kind of, responding to what we read. But eventually we move beyond the strictly emotional response. And that's something the formalists wanted too. For them, rigorous analysis really sort of needed to be objective to some extent, and they would just argue that emotions don't really factor in when we're figuring out how language works. Now, I would kind of dispute that, because sometimes if we're thinking about word choice, or if we're thinking about certain kinds of figurative language, and that's another thing we're obviously looking for in a close reading, metaphors, similes, but sometimes that stuff does kind of operate a little bit on an emotional level. So I don't think we have to disregard emotions altogether, but just like with the author, right? There is value to knowing stuff about the author, and in certain cases we want to. And there is value with, being emotional and focusing on our emotional response, but neither of those things will get you a close reading. They're both taking you outside of the text, and you're either getting into the author or you're getting into yourself. Either way, you're leaving the language of the text. So for now, we are trying to kind of avoid these two fallacies that were laid out by the new critics. We don't always have to avoid them. It's okay to sometimes talk about how we feel, and it's okay to sometimes talk about the author, but not so much when we are close reading. And just my final thought on the affective fallacy, again, the reason that can be a little bit of a problem, or just a little bit of a less productive approach, is because we can often get caught up in what's sort of called like value judgment, or like just sort of reaching an assessment of the text based on whether or not we like it, or how it made us feel. It made me happy, I liked it, it was great. Or it made me sad, it's depressing. That's fine, we can work with those emotions, but we want to at some point make a bigger move and make some more sophisticated moves. If we just stay stuck on I liked it, it was good, it made me feel blank, that's just limited. None of that's bad, but we just, we don't want to stop there. We want to get into the language, into the text, and make some more discoveries, make some more original claims, and actually arrive at an interpretation. But one of the first steps towards an interpretation can be that initial emotional response. But that should lead you to other things. That should not be the ultimate destination. So you might want to keep those two fallacies in mind as we continue to work. All right, so now let's take a look at my two examples. All right, starting with Sonny's Blues. So like I said, I chose a passage here, and in my case, I just chose a single paragraph, not a very large section of text. And you really don't need a large section of text. Again, sometimes the smaller your passage, the better, because you're only looking at a handful of sentences, so you can really focus on what's there. My paragraph, I believe, I'll double check this, but I think it consists of 5 sentences. So it's not a super short paragraph, but it's not a particularly long paragraph either. Sort of a mid-sized paragraph. It seems kind of innocuous in some ways. Not a whole lot happens in the paragraph if we're just thinking about plot. But a lot is happening on the level of language. So I really chose to kind of lean into some individual words and some structures that I noticed, some patterns, some things pertaining to sentence structure and the way Baldwin is literally building his sentences. It creates a certain effect, and I also think it reinforces certain ideas that are, obviously important for the overall text. So we'll do that one first, and then we'll move to the Red Wheelbarrow. And that poem's so short, I just went ahead and close read the whole thing. It's only 8 lines. So we can just cover the entire poem. Okay, so we'll start with Sonny's Blues. Here's the paragraph. I'm sorry, I'm using the ebook version of our textbook, so I think my pagination's different from you guys. That's why I haven't been giving you page numbers for our reading assignments. I know that's kind of annoying. Just get in touch with your table of contents or your index for the reader, and you should be able to find everything. But this passage comes about midway through Sonny's Blues. It's roughly 25 pages into the short story. So you don't have to find it. I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. And again, it's a pretty short paragraph, but this is my passage that I chose to close read. So we're starting with dialogue. I just want to be clear. I'll read it, but just keep in mind we're starting with Sonny speaking. So we get multiple lines of dialogue in this paragraph from Sonny. And that's how we start. That's also how we end. So we start with, "I ain't learning nothing in school," he said, "even when I go." So that's the end of the first part of the dialogue. The next sentence is, "He turned away from me." So this is our narrator, our first person narrator, Sonny's brother, of course, narrating. "He turned away from me and opened the window and threw his cigarette out into the narrow alley." Period. Next sentence. "I watched his back." Period. Next sentence. "He slammed the window so hard I thought the glass would fly out and turned back to me." Period. And then we end with a final line of dialogue, again from Sonny. "And I'm sick of the stink of these garbage cans!" Exclamation mark, close quote marks, end of passage. So that's it. That's it. And what you'll notice here, and this is how you know that you're kind of getting in the weeds in a way that's really conducive to a good close reading. I would be hard-pressed to do a plot summary of this passage. On the level of plot, not a whole lot is happening, right? We have two characters having a conversation. There is some movement. There are actions in addition to words on display here. But not a whole lot really happens. And again, we also you can notice this, right? Even when we're talking about stuff like tension, conflict, patterns, the way we often talk about that stuff is we do it in summary form, right? We talk about the overall story and we point out those things, but we kind of construct our own narrative. We put it all in a sort of summary fashion where it's almost like we are reporting on the story or we are recapping the story. And that's often how we talk about language, by summarizing, right? But there's no real way to summarize here. All I can do with a passage like this is dig into specific aspects of language because there ain't much to summarize. They're just talking. Now, important stuff is happening, but in order to uncover that, I have to do a real close read. So what I'm going to do now is just share with you the stuff that I found, the features that I found interesting in this passage. Like I said before, the stuff that you would find if you were reading this passage would probably be different from what I found. So don't feel like my answers or my claims, my interpretations are the only correct ones. They very much are not. I'm just showing you an example of the kind of stuff you could be doing. So one of the first things I noticed as I was reading this passage was kind of a motif or a sort of recurring idea of leaving, of trying to get out. And I just noticed this in the form of individual words. So again, I'm sort of noticing patterns to start with. So in the second sentence, this is Sonny's dialogue here. He says, "Even when I go." So he's saying, I'm not learning anything in school, even when I go. So we have the word go. Okay, that ends the second sentence. Then the third sentence, "He turned away from me and opened the window and threw his cigarette out into the narrow alley." So out, go, out. Okay, we're sort of emphasizing this feeling or this desire to leave, to go, to depart. And it gets emphasized a final time. A couple of sentences later, "He slammed the window so hard I thought the glass would fly out." So we have the repetition of the word out. First, his cigarette went out. Now, Sonny slams the window so hard, the narrator thinks that the window glass is going to go out. So interesting that at first it's Sonny who's going or wanting to leave. Again, we could use context clues, of course. We could look at other nearby paragraphs and see that the larger conversation that they're having at this point in the narrative pertains to Sonny wanting to leave Harlem. Literally, he wants to leave. He wants to go. And his brother is trying to convince him to not do that. But we don't have to look at context clues in order to understand that, because it's being expressed right here in a kind of subtle way. Go, out, out. Again, we see that repetition. And that captures this desire, and it's Sonny's desire, right? But it's also personified by inanimate objects that aren't Sonny. The cigarette goes out. The glass in the window might go out. They almost represent Sonny. They're helping to convey Sonny's feelings. He wants to go out. He wants to leave. We get this sense of confinement, right? This feeling of being trapped. And that gets emphasized throughout the passage. When he throws his cigarette out, he throws it into the alley. But it's not just any alley. It's the narrow alley. So there's a clear choice there. We don't have to get bogged down in intention to notice that Baldwin chose to describe the alley as narrow. If the alley wasn't very important, if we didn't need to form a clear image of it in our head, the author probably wouldn't have described it in that way. But it's not just an alley, it's a narrow alley. And in that alley, there's a cigarette that Sonny tossed. There's also trash cans that stink. And that's how the passage ends, with Sonny complaining about the trash cans. So again, all of that works to create this feeling of being trapped, confined. The alley is narrow. The trash cans are in there. We feel like we're cramped. We feel like we can't get out. Okay, so that was the first thing I noticed. Another thing, pretty clear, but they kind of help to bookend the passage. Two things. If you look at the third sentence of the passage, he turned away from me, the narrator says. He turned away from me and opened the window and throws his cigarette out. Okay, so we see that early in the passage. Sonny turns away from his brother. Okay, and then near the end of the passage, in the second to last sentence, at the end of that second to last sentence of the passage, we see that Sonny turns back to the narrator. So it's a simple movement, but it clearly has symbolic value. So in an official close read, like our SAR2, you can make the claim that this simple movement, right, turning away and then turning back to his brother, kind of symbolizes or represents the larger relationship between the two brothers. Their relationship is kind of a sequence of turning away and then turning back to each other. Early in the story, again, we are leaving our passage now, but we can do this when we're making our larger thematic connections. Early in the story, Sonny and his brother are estranged. And then we see in the text where Sonny does kind of turn away from him. And then later they kind of reconnect. So this simple action of turning away and then turning back, it matters. It doesn't just matter within the passage, but if we want to do some of our larger thematic connections, it seems to help to kind of sum up their relationship, really, and how it's gone. So that's significant. And also, it's just a nice sort of symmetrical way of structuring the passage. At the beginning, Sonny turns one way. At the end, he turns a different way. So it's movement providing structure within the paragraph. I could talk about that a little bit as well. And just the fact that he's turning away and then he's turning back, that expresses some degree of tension. Right? Maybe some degree of ambivalence. Their relationship is complicated. It has had ups and downs, highs and lows. So, maybe that's a tension that gets expressed just from the fact that he's turning away and then turning back. Two different movements performed in a very close proximity. So, that might say something about Sonny's state of mind, right? We can talk about characters. Characters are on display, but only two of them. We really should just focus on Sonny and the narrator and their relationship and how it's being sort of captured in this brief scene. Okay, so those are some things I noticed right away. And then as I looked a little bit more, I started to notice the repetition of the word "and." And this got me thinking a little bit about the use of that particular coordinating conjunction. So this is kind of an interesting thing. You guys don't need to make this exact same kind of move, but this is just an example of what an observation can ultimately become. So at first, I just observed that the word "and" appears a lot in this passage within a few of the sentences. We see it repeated, and I noticed that. So then I started thinking more about it, and I began to, consider that it might be an example, that use of "and" might be an example of a particular literary technique known as parataxis. So you guys, I'm not expecting you guys to know what parataxis is, but this is where close reading can take you. So I noticed the repetition of an individual word, and then I'm starting to think about a larger literary technique that might be used here. So just for the sake of this little demo, let me talk about parataxis for a moment. It's a particular literary technique that we can find in poetry or prose fiction, like short stories or novels. It can really appear as two different things, but they're related. Typically, it's just going to be like a series of short statements. They can be short sentences or individual clauses within sentences, but they tend to be relatively short, simple statements that are going to be strung together in the writing, either without any conjunctions, without anything kind of joining them together, or if conjunctions are used, it will just be really simple coordinating conjunctions like the word "and." So that's all parataxis is, but it establishes a very particular kind of rhythm because we have a lot of these short statements that are either just stuck together or they're joined together with the word "and." So that creates a rhythm and a sort of pattern, and it also can help to convey meaning. So let me show you how we can maybe find parataxis in the passage. I might be going out a little bit on a limb. It's not super clear, but we do see "and" enough to make the case that there's at least a little bit of parataxis at work in this text. Okay, starting with the third sentence. So once we get past Sonny's initial dialogue and we kind of shift back to the narrator, we could also talk about point of view, because obviously our narrator is telling us what's going on, but we also get Sonny's voice a lot. So we're often switching back and forth from Sonny's voice and Sonny's perspective back to the narrator and his perspective and his voice. So that's interesting too. And we see that here as we leave Sonny's dialogue and go back to the narrator. He turned away from me and opened the window and threw his cigarette out into the narrow alley. So it's subtle, but just notice in that sentence that we're joining together really three separate actions. Sonny's doing three separate things in that sentence. First, he turns away from the narrator, which has literal significance just in terms of like spatial relationships, right? But also, as we've already seen, probably some larger symbolic importance as well. So first, Sonny turns away from the narrator. Then he throws his cigarette out of the window. And then, he turns away, he opens the window. So his second action is opening the window. And then his third action is throwing his cigarette out of the now opened window. So that's actually a fair amount of activity. We could have actually spent a little bit longer narrating those three actions, particularly, opening the window and then throwing the cigarette out. The whole process probably only took a matter of seconds, but those are three separate discrete actions, one following the next, and the way one following the other, and the way that Baldwin presents it is sort of parataxis. He's using those coordinating conjunctions and to string together three short statements. Sonny turned away from me, he opened the window, and he threw his cigarette out of the window. An example of like classic parataxis where you don't have any conjunctions at all. This is the one I learned. I think it's on the Wikipedia page if you look up parataxis. It's the old apocryphal quote attributed to Julius Caesar. I came, I saw, I conquered. the way that quote is usually presented is without conjunctions. He's not saying I saw and I came and I conquered. He's just stringing together three simple statements, in that case without using any conjunctions at all. So again, that creates a kind of staccato kind of rhythm, right? Where it's like these short, brief little phrases or statements, and they're strung together in a way that creates a certain effect for readers. So a lot of scholars will say what parataxis kind of does is it kind of mirrors the way that people talk. In a lot of cases, it almost mirrors the way children talk, right? If you ever listen to a kid like narrate their day, like, oh, what did you do at school today? They'll often use sort of this form, right? Oh, I did this, and then I did that, and then we did that, and then we did this other thing, and then I came home. So it's kind of natural. It's a way that a lot of people present information in speech when we're often not really thinking about sentence structure. But when we see it in text, it often has a lot of different effects that we can track. So one thing it does, particularly in prose, and I think we see it here, is like each statement seems equally important and equally emphasized, because we're either not using conjunctions at all, or we're just using coordinating conjunctions. So we're kind of getting into the weeds of grammar here, and I know a lot of you probably would not want to do this, but you probably do know the difference between coordinating and subordinating when it comes to sentence structure and like the way we're building sentences. So again, and is a coordinating conjunction, but we also have conjunctions that work to subordinate. So in some cases, some clauses will be subordinate to other clauses, which means, this clause is the most important, and then we have this less important clause that's hooked onto it. So when we have subordination, we have sort of like a value ranking, right? This is the most important part of the sentence, and this is the less important part, right? That's what happens when we have subordinate clauses and we're using subordination in our structure. But when we just use coordination, we don't really have a hierarchy of value. Everything gets emphasized equally. I did this, I did that, I did that, I did that thing, right? I did this and this and this and this, and they're all kind of equal. They're all presented as potentially equal. And it's up to you to decide if that matters or what effect that has on readers or how it might help to convey meaning. But it is an interesting thing to observe. Now, just keep in mind, if you're looking at poetry, parataxis also shows up a lot in poetry, but we usually refer to it as a little bit of a different thing than what it is in a short story or a novel. With poetry, we think of parataxis usually as a technique where two very different images or two very different fragments or ideas are juxtaposed. They'll be presented side by side, but initially those two images or ideas, they seem to be contradictory. They don't really seem to go together. They don't really seem to mesh. But of course, if we dig a little bit deeper, we can often find how they do go together. This is often kind of how metaphors work, right? Comparisons between two unlike things. At first, these don't seem like things that we would compare, but if we think about it a little bit more, they actually do have similarities. So just keep that in mind. We could actually find some examples of that. Well, I'll hold off on further thoughts about juxtaposing different images until we get to the red wheelbarrow. But just to go back to our passage from Baldwin, just to show you the other example of parataxis. So I showed you the first one. And then our next sentence after he turns away, opens the window, and throws the cigarette out of the window into the narrow alley. These are all equally important, right? Nothing is being ranked higher than the others. They're all equally important. They're all in sequence. They create a rhythm. Then we have our next sentence, a very short sentence that's different. I watched his back. Well, I put that sentence in brackets because it's important. It might have a double meaning, and I want to come back to it. But it's also very different than the sentences that come before or after. It's very short. It's almost like independent. It stands alone in some ways, and it expresses an interesting meaning. Then the next sentence, we get back into parataxis. He slammed the window so hard, I thought the glass would fly out, comma, and turn back to me. So again, this is the narrator describing Sonny's movements. So he slams the window, and then he turns back to face the narrator. But again, notice the use of and. He slammed the window so hard, I thought the glass would fly out, and turn back to me. So the first part is longer and more detailed, but again, he's using and to string together a bunch of statements. He slammed the window really hard, he turned back to me, and our final and leads us back to Sonny's dialogue. Our very last sentence begins with the word and I'm sick of the stink of these garbage cans. So that's Sonny talking again. But notice the effect that's created by starting that line of dialogue with and. It really goes well with the previous sentence. So let's take a look at those final two sentences of the passage again. He slammed the window so hard I thought the glass would fly out and turn back to me. And I'm sick of the stink of these garbage cans. Right? So when we read it all together, once again, we have a pattern. We have multiple ands serving to string together multiple statements in a really kind of simple coordinating structure where everything gets sort of the same emphasis, the same level of importance, and we create this kind of staccato rhythm as we read. And just to go back to parataxis a final time, like I was saying, with poetry, often we think of it almost like as a contradiction, right? Or two things that just seem different or like polar opposites, but there's some relationship between them. We almost get a version of that here at the very end of this prose passage, because the way Sonny's dialogue is presented, again, if we're paying attention, we can obviously tell who's talking. It's not that difficult to figure it out, but there is a little bit of a jarring shift, and we actually see it multiple times in the passage as we go from Sonny's dialogue to the narrator's perspective. Or here, we go from the narrator's perspective back to Sonny's dialogue. And at the beginning of the passage, we got an attribution. So after the first bit of Sonny's dialogue, I ain't learning nothing in school, we get the attribution, he said. Okay? Just so we're clear that that's Sonny talking. But notice at the end of the passage, we don't get an attribution. We don't get Sonny said. We just get his words, following right after the narrator's observations. So after the narrator has told us that Sonny slammed the window so hard that even the glass wants to get out, just like Sonny wants to get out, and then Sonny turns back to him, and then Sonny's talking. But that's a pretty big shift in perspective just to go from one sentence to the next. We get the narrator and what the narrator is seeing, and then boom, immediately we're back into Sonny's voice. So that's a little bit jarring. Again, if we're paying attention, it's not hard to follow, but you'll notice that this is the first time we're hearing about the trash cans or the stink of the trash cans in the passage. They have not previously been mentioned, but we have heard about the alley. We know the alley is narrow. We know that Sonny has no problem throwing a cigarette out there, so we should have an image of the alley already in our minds, and now we can see the garbage cans in the alley. Now another one of our senses is also engaged, not just our sense of sight, but our sense of smell. Now we can imagine an unpleasant odor coming from that narrow alley and those trash cans. So, you know, it's good on that level, but also it does feel a little bit jarring or discordant with what comes before, because now we get new information, new stuff. We're right back in Sonny's voice. So that's kind of part of the parataxis effect. It really is all about removing certain parts of sentences that we often find in writing, removing conjunctions, or only using simple coordinating conjunctions. Again, it matters. If you find parataxis, that means you're going to find a very particular kind of sentence structure, where either, again, there's no conjunctions or there's only coordination. There's only coordinating conjunctions. So it matters, right? And even at the end, that's sort of, again, what parataxis can sometimes do, kind of bringing things together without always an initial explanation or an obvious transition, right? That's part of what this technique does, and we kind of see that at the end as we go from the narrator's perspective right into a line of dialogue from Sonny that seems a little bit unrelated to what they had previously been discussing. At the beginning of the passage, he's talking about school. And then by the end, he's complaining about the trash cans, right? But again, that abrupt nature of his complaint, that matters too, because that probably means that he smelled those trash cans before. This is a long-running grievance. He's sick of it. He wants to get out, and we have a clear image of that in our mind. So those were just some things that we could explore, just some things that I found as I was reading through. Oh yeah, and then finally, I watched his back. The connotation of that phrase, thinking about it sort of from our modern perspective, we sort of know what that saying means. That's kind of like a colloquial saying that we hear a lot in our society. Oh, I have your back. I'll watch your back. We know what that means. It kind of has this sense of, oh, I'll help you, I'll support you, I'll be there to help if you get into trouble or if you need me, right? So we kind of know what that means. Now, I don't know if that was a popular meaning of the phrase back in the 1950s when Baldwin wrote this short story. If we were doing a larger analysis, we could research that and figure it out. For now, we don't really have to care if that's how Baldwin meant the phrase. Again, we don't have to worry about his intentions. We don't have to worry about historical facts. We just know that we read it that way, right? Modern readers are going to read that sentence at least as having that potential double meaning. This is, of course, Sonny's older brother. He's supposed to look out for Sonny. He's supposed to protect Sonny. We get the sense, again, I'm leaving the passage, but we do kind of get the sense that maybe he hasn't felt like he's always done a great job of protecting Sonny or supporting Sonny, right? So there is that implied meaning that is based on our kind of modern lexicon, our modern sort of colloquial sayings, but that does matter. Because if we're thinking about word choice or, analyzing individual phrases or sentences, we're often thinking about connotations, like what are the associations that those words bring to mind? What do those words make us think about? What do those words sort of conjure up? What images do they put in our minds? We can always explore that. But there's also a literal meaning of the sentence, and it's a little bit more practical and sort of straightforward, but the narrator is literally looking at Sonny's back. Literally, because at this point, Sonny has turned away from him as he's, opening the window, throwing the cigarette out. So literally, the narrator is looking at Sonny's back. And if you're looking at somebody's back as opposed to their face, that can have symbolic value. That can mean they're leaving. That can mean that you're watching them go. But of course, we get a reversal. We get a turn in this passage because Sonny turns back around. But also, there's that possible meaning that, the narrator wants to support and protect Sonny. Sort of using our own modern understanding of what that phrase could mean. And we might also notice the repetition of the word back. I watched his back, and then in the very next sentence, we get the word being used in a different way. In the next sentence, Sonny turns back or turned back to me. Me being, of course, the narrator. So at first, the back is literally Sonny's back, a part of his body. And then the second time, the word describes his movement as he turns back around to face his brother. So we could do stuff with that too. So again, I was mostly focused on word choice. sentence structure. I got into the parataxis stuff, but that's just an example of what I could find after doing a little close reading. So I have a lot of material to pursue. I could build an analysis around a lot of the individual elements that I was discussing. I wouldn't even have to cover everything that I've just been mentioning. I could really just dig into the motif of leaving, or I could dig into parataxis, or I could do something with back. It would really be totally just up to me, whatever I wanted to pursue. Okay, so quickly, let's turn now to The Red Wheelbarrow by William Carlos Williams. I will leave the text for a moment. Let me cheat just for a moment and to give you guys a little bit of context that will just help you as readers. Again, if you're doing a close reading, you don't need to get into this, but it just might help you for right now. This is an example of what we called imagism once upon a time. This is a particular kind of poetry that's, as the name suggests, very focused on imagery. Vivid images often rendered in clear, direct language. And William Carlos Williams was a pretty famous practitioner of imagist style poetry. This was pretty popular in the early 20th century, first half of the 1900s. Ezra Pound was another contemporary of Williams who kind of worked in that same vein. So I wanted to mention Pound earlier when we were talking about parataxis in poetry. You don't have to worry about Pound. We're not reading him. But he's a pretty important American poet. You'll have to read him at some point if you continue with literature. And one of his big contributions was he helped to popularize the haiku and other like Eastern forms of poetry that the Western world did not know as much about. And if you guys know about haikus, you know that they're kind of working on a principle a little bit similar to parataxis. A lot of Eastern poetry does. And a lot of Pound's poetry does. A lot of the imagist poems kind of work in a similar way, where we're juxtaposing images or ideas that often don't really seem to go together, but in fact they do. If you know haikus, that's often kind of the logic that haikus operate on. We often get these kind of disparate images, but there is something linking them together. There are relationships, but they're not always necessarily explained, so we have to do the interpretive work ourselves as readers. But in this case, this is a pretty simple poem, I think in some ways, a little bit deceptively simple perhaps. But unlike some examples of parataxis or some other examples of imagist poetry, the images here do seem to go together, I think, more or less. They do seem to be linked in a pretty logical way, but we can still do a lot with imagery. And of course, this is a short poem, but if we're paying close attention, we should notice that it really consists of three distinct images. So we have the red wheelbarrow, okay, that's number one. We have the rainwater glazing the red wheelbarrow, okay, that's our second image, the rainwater. And then our third image is the white chickens. Okay, so again, I feel like we're probably on a farm. These do seem like related imagery, related images, right? A wheelbarrow, chickens, apparently it's raining or it was raining, so we're outside. It feels like we're outside, maybe in a barnyard or some kind of maybe rural setting or a farm of some kind. So we have this linkage of imagery. Remember I mentioned last week, you can often find patterns of imagery. When you're doing a close reading, you might not just want to focus on individual images, you might want to find a pattern in those images or in how they're presented, or at least a sequence, a progression. So here we have a sequence of three images. Red wheelbarrow, the rainwater on that red wheelbarrow, and then the white chickens that the wheelbarrow is next to or nearby. Okay, so we can dig into any one of those three images, but we also might want to start thinking about word choice. Why is the wheelbarrow red? Again, we don't have to ask what does Williams mean by making the wheelbarrow red. We'll never know. He's been dead for a long time. So we just have to figure out what the color means for us right here in this particular text. What does red do? What are the connotations that the color might bring to mind. Red can represent a lot of things, some good, or some kind of viewed favorably, others maybe not. So why is the wheelbarrow red? What is the contrast between red and white? Because we have the white chickens, okay, alongside the red wheelbarrow. So what does that contrast do? What kind of effect does that contrast create? And we can also think about how rainwater looks. We can't exactly assign a color to the rainwater, but we do get that word glazed. Makes me think of glazed donuts. But what does it mean for the red wheelbarrow to be glazed with rainwater? Just ask yourself literally, what does that look like? The first image is easy. The third image is easy. I think that second image with the rainwater is a little bit harder to visualize. So take a moment. What is that second image? And what are the larger relationships between all three images? While also thinking about colors and thinking about a word like glazed, which seems to be doing some important work as well. So we could do a lot with word choice. We might also notice, if we're thinking about individual words, and I noticed this when I was reading it, we have two words that are broken up. So if you notice the words wheelbarrow and rainwater, those are both single words. All right, the way they usually appear in writing, those are single words. But if you look at the poem, those words are broken up. So we have wheel and barrow separated, and then we have rain and water separated. Okay, so why? Again, we're not worried so much about the author's intention. We're just worried about the meaning that the separation of those words creates. And this will lead us to a consideration of poetic form. If we're looking at how these lines are constructed, how the lines of the poem are arranged, we're going to notice that barrow and water, the sort of separated parts of those larger words, they end up forming the fourth and sixth lines of the poem. Okay, so first we get barrow. That's a two-syllable word all by itself on the line. And then in the sixth line, we get water, which is, again, usually thought of as a two-syllable word. It's by itself on the line. So we can see pretty clearly that breaking those words helps to sort of reinforce or even create the form and structure of the poem, the way the lines are actually arranged. So you might notice that all of the even numbered lines, 2, 4, 6, and 8, they all consist of a single two-syllable word, right? So we start with upon, then we have barrow, then we have water, then we have chickens on the final line, 8th line. All right, so that's a pattern, right? Every even numbered line consists of one word, and they're always two-syllable words. And then we can notice that the odd numbered lines all consist of either 3 or 4 syllables. So we do have a meter, a pretty recognizable pattern or structure which governs individual lines. There's no rhyme scheme, but we might almost think of the structure here as sort of being like 4 separate couplets. Remember, we talked about couplets a few weeks ago. Those are just 2 lines that go together, and they might appear at the end of older traditional poetry, or some traditional poetry consisted of nothing but couplets. So we almost kind of get 4 couplets here, but there isn't a rhyme scheme. We don't get the end rhyme that we traditionally would have with couplets. But it's almost like Williams might be borrowing a little bit of that structure, but he's not using iambic pentameter. But he does have his own sort of pattern when it comes to syllables, when it comes to how his lines are arranged. Again, there's only 8 lines here, so we can really dig into all of them, and we're going to notice a lot of patterns at the level of words and syllables, and also images. So a lot to do there. And the final thing I wanted to mention, and this might not strike all of us as interesting, but I thought it was interesting. the very first phrase that we see in the poem, so much. So much depends on these three images that we've been talking about, these three things, or these three discrete images: the wheelbarrow, the rain on the wheelbarrow, and then the white chickens. So much depends on these things. I guess really they depend on the wheelbarrow first and foremost. But what depends? We open the poem with a very strange phrase. So much is strange, the way it's being used here. So I wanted to dig into that opening phrase, so much. How much? What exactly are we talking about here? What exactly depends on the wheelbarrow? It's not specified. It's never really explained. So here's a moment where we need to interpret something. Okay? So what is that opening phrase? Like, what type of speech is it? I actually Googled this. I looked into it a little bit more. Again, staying inside the text. I'm not researching Williams. I'm not thinking about how I feel about the wheelbarrow or the chickens. Or that one time I went to my uncle's farm and he had chickens, kind of like these chickens. I'm not doing that, right? I'm just thinking about so much. So much. What is that? Okay, well, I've learned a few things. That phrase can actually be several different types of language. It can be an adverbial phrase. It can work as an adverb. It can work as an adjective. And it can also work as a pronoun. And this is what really struck me as cool. I think the way it's being used here is as a pronoun. I think you could make the argument that it's being used as an adverb. I don't think it's being used as an adjective. When it's an adjective, it's just like an intensifier. Like, oh man, I ate so much popcorn. Like, that's not how we're using it. So I think we can cross off adjective. It's not being used as an adjective. And I think it's being used as a pronoun, right? We know what a pronoun does, right? It's like a placeholder. All right, it's a word that takes the place of a noun. So instead of saying John did it, he did it. Instead of saying Anna did it, she did it. Instead of specifying all the members of a group, you say they did it. All right? Or if it's not a human, it did it. So we know pronouns. They're a very common type of language. We use them all the time. But if we think about so much as working like a pronoun sort of phrase, then that really leads us to some interesting thoughts. Because in this case, if we really look up the definition of so much as a pronoun, and you can look this up in Merriam-Webster or any online dictionary, I did, it will tell you that what we're dealing with here is an undetermined amount. When we use so much as a pronoun, what we notice is we don't actually know the noun that this pronoun is standing in for. So much refers to something that's undetermined. It refers to a particular but unspecified amount or quantity. We don't know what the amount is. We don't know what the quantity is. We know there's something, but we don't know what it is. We don't actually know what this pronoun is standing in for because we don't know exactly what depends on the wheelbarrow. We don't know how much of it depends. So not only do we not know what that something is, we don't know how much of that something there is. How much or how little. It's undetermined, it's unspecified. But if we think of so much as a pronoun and we don't know what it's referring to, we don't know the quantity or the amount that it's referencing, then we have an obvious task in front of us. We have to figure it out, right? I think the conclusion we could draw here is that the poem is leaving the amount unspecified. It's somewhat open-ended and ambiguous. It's not being told to us. So as readers, we have to decide what depends on the red wheelbarrow and how much of it depends. We have to determine the amount. We have to determine that undetermined something that the pronoun is referring back to. So we can replace so much with something specific, something provided by us in our interpretation. So that would be another cool way to come up with some original analysis and to arrive ultimately at an interpretation of what the poem really is saying, right? What if we can determine what is depending on the wheelbarrow, then we're going to know what the poem is ultimately saying. All right, so again, close reading is just another way to get to your ultimate destination of sort of unpacking the theme and making a larger sort of conclusion about what the text means, what it does, and why it matters. But if you can show that you're paying close attention to specific pieces of language, it's just going to make your analysis better. It's going to make your analysis feel more complete, more comprehensive, and it just shows your facility, not just with big stuff, not just with the history, the themes, the big stuff that we're all pretty comfortable with, but also we're getting at that granular language level, and you can show your ability to deal with that stuff too. Just another tool for our toolboxes as literature students. So this week we're doing our second short analytical response. I want it to be a close reading. Don't leave the text, but you can ultimately leave your passage. I want you to spend most of your time analyzing your specific passage. So first, you choose a text. It can be any text we've read so far. And then you choose a specific passage within that text, just like I've done with my examples. Spend most of your time analyzing the language in your passage, but then ultimately, eventually, you need to make that connection between your passage and the larger theme at work and show how the language in your passage is helping to express these larger ideas that are so central to the overall text. Okay, so read my instructions. Hopefully this lecture helped, but if you still have questions, also don't forget about those handouts that I posted last week. But if you still have questions, email me. We can always talk, set up a video conference, whatever you want to do. Otherwise, good luck, and I'll see you next week as we get started on literary criticism and theory.